Welcome to the channel, guys. In this one we'll be going over 5 simple steps on how to make closed terrariums. So let's get started. Closed terrariums are just self-contained ecosystems that can be very easy to maintain. Because of how they're set up, all the moisture is going to stay inside the container that you set it up in, as long as it's sealed correctly, and that water is basically going to create its own water cycle and own life cycle in its ecosystem. So the first step to creating a closed terrarium is going to be selecting the right container. Now when you're first getting started, I recommend using something cheap like an old water bottle, a 2-liter soda bottle. You could even try making one in a mason jar. It really doesn't matter what the closed terrarium will be set up in, as long as it's a sealed and clear container. However, it is important to make sure this container is going to be big enough for you to plant and scape everything that you want inside it, as well as small enough to be able to maintain humidity and that water cycle flowing to all the plants. Step number 2, and potentially the most important step, is going to be to add a drainage layer. The drainage layer doesn't need to be anything special. Its main function is going to be to keep the water away from the rest of the soil, so the water's not sitting in the soil, making it mold, get mildewy faster than the ecosystem can actually handle. So whatever you use, whether it's going to be gravel or activated carbon, just make sure you have a thick enough layer, usually 1 to 2 or 3 inches depending on the size of your container, so all the water you have in there can drain down to that bottom layer and then evaporate out to the top of the container again. Number 3 is going to be the substrate. I like to use a mix of cocoa fiber and sphagnum moss, maybe some orchid bark. You can definitely use just regular soil from outside, but whatever you use, make sure you add something like sphagnum moss or bark and make it a little easier for roots and the water to get into and out of. Step number 4 is going to be selecting the right plants to keep in your terrarium. Again, just like the containers, I recommend just trying to find the cheapest plants you can, especially when you're first starting out, whether or not that's just going out into the woods next to your house, finding some moss, some smaller plants, whatever it's going to be. So most ferns, mosses, and tropical plants are going to do really well in closed terrariums. And the final touch for step number 5 is going to be to add a cleanup crew. I always use springtails in mine. You could use isopods. Usually it's best to stay with something a little smaller, such as springtails, since it is going to be set up in an airtight container. But the springtails are going to take care of any mold or mildew that does start to grow in your terrarium, which is a natural thing. But they're going to eat that, break it down, and kind of return everything back to nutrients for the plants. If any plants grow and die, they're going to break those down. Basically any biological material that will end up breaking down in the tank, those springtails are going to take care of them, be able to turn that back into nutrients for any other new plants that start growing. A couple other tips and tricks: make sure that your container is going to be completely sealed so that none of that water escapes. If you do have something that you feel like the water is escaping from, you can just pop the lid off, add a little water. It's not technically fully closed, but it doesn't really matter. It'll still work pretty much the same. If you do water it, or when you do water it to begin with, make sure you add just very little water. You can always go back and add water later, but most of the time less is more in these terrariums, since the water's not going to be going anywhere. All in all, closed terrariums are a great way to start getting used to plants, terrariums. It's a good way to get started, especially if you use cheap materials for your containers as well as the plants. You can test a lot of different things, kind of work on your green thumb, as well as keeping everything else alive and healthy in the terrariums. Do a lot of different setups before you actually start to add any animals or anything like that into real terrariums. So when you're first starting, just make sure to follow those 5 simple steps and you'll most likely see success in those closed terrariums. If things are dying, make sure to tweak little things, maybe make your drainage layer a little more, add more or less water, add more springtails, try different plants. Just try a lot of different things until you feel like you've got a feel for it, and then you can start moving into a lot of other different areas in the hobbies. Drop some comments down below if you have any questions or comments about how your closed terrariums are going. If you liked this video, make sure to hit that subscribe. If you're not familiar with closed terrariums, or you want to see a few builds, I'll link a few down below. As well, I'll link my springtail video if you're not familiar with those, and you can check that video out for a little more information there. Thanks for watching.